Good morning. Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. I'd also like to recognize Dean Doug Anderson. He's the Dean of the Huntsman School. Doug, would you stand for just a second? And also my department chair, Jim Davis, seated right behind him. With their support and the resources they provide, helps me carry out the research that I'm really passionate about, that I think is relevant, and hopefully you are the testament that it's relevant because you're here and interested in what I find and what some of my colleagues find with respect to toxic work environments. So I like to start presentations with a question. Get people thinking rather than just taking it all in. So how many of you have worked alongside a rude or uncivil coworker? If they're sitting beside you, just kind of like nod your head like this. You know, maybe don't raise your hand. All right. Most of us have, as we'll see in just a minute. Think about how those experiences affected you, your work, your health, maybe even your family, and your desire to maybe even get revenge. One of my interests in this field of research came out of a conversation that I had with a colleague from my MBA program. When I went into the Vanderbilt MBA program, it was 2000. The dot-com bubble had not burst yet, and people were graduating that year in 2000 with $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 signing bonuses. They had multiple offers. When I graduated in 2002, 40% of us had jobs. There were no signing bonuses. You were lucky to have a job at all. When I met with some other colleagues about 6 months after graduation, we had a little mixer and we were talking about how things were going, kind of networking and things like that. And one of the guys that I'd worked on several group projects with, because as an MBA student you do tons of group work, I asked him, I said, so, how are things going? How do you like him work? And he was like, oh, it's awful. He said, I hate my boss, I hate my coworkers. He says, it's just a miserable place to work. And I was a psych major in undergrad and psychologist kind of by training and a little bit by trade. And so I said, well, how are you dealing with that? Because there weren't a lot of jobs to be had even then. He said, well, I've looked around, there's just nothing. I keep applying. And he said, it's really stressful and I'm just miserable all the time. I said, well, how are you managing that? How are you managing the stress? And he kind of looked around. He said, come here. Yeah? He said, there's this supply closet at work. Okay? He said, it's got like T-shirts and pens and notepads and stuff like that in it. Okay? He said, I either go into work early or I leave late and I steal boxes of stuff from this closet. I was like, why? He said, because it makes me feel better. I can't get out. I can't talk back to my boss. Excuse me. I can't really take it out of my coworkers because I can't get fired because I don't want to go live in mom and dad's basement. So it makes me feel better. I said, well, what do you do with it? He said, oh, well, now it's sitting at home in my closet. So people find ways of dealing with the stress, and they're not always productive, as we'll see in just a minute. So let's look at an example of what we would probably call uncivil coworker behavior or rude coworker behavior. How many of you watch The Office or used to watch it before it was finished? All right, this is a scene from The Office. And this is actually an employee taking out his frustration and being uncivil to a boss, which happens sometimes as well.
You are out of your damn little pea-sized mind. What is wrong with you? Do you have any sense at all? Okay. Do you have any idea how to run an office? Yes. Every day you do something stupider than you did the day before. And I think there's no possible way he can top that. Okay. But what do? You find a way, damn it, to top it. You are a professional idiot. Hey, stop!
Now, if I polled you guys again, there's probably a handful of people who have seen this behavior at work. Hopefully you haven't been the target of it, but I've worked places where I wasn't the target, but there was a boss who screamed, who yelled, who slammed doors, who threw things, things like that. And we'll talk about some of those boss behaviors in a minute. But incivility mostly focuses on coworker behaviors, who we work alongside of and their behaviors. And generally, we think about them as low-level behaviors compared to some of the other more egregious behaviors. So it's basically rudeness, talking down to others, not listening, talking over or interrupting. How many of you have had that in a meeting? Gets on my last nerve. Withholding information from somebody who maybe needs that information to do their job. Not paying much attention or showing interest in other people's opinions, belittling their opinion or making derogatory remarks. So, unpleasant behaviors. Maybe not openly hostile, and it may not even be intentional. I won't ask you to raise your hand. Any of you see yourself maybe in some of those behaviors? We may not think of them as being a big deal, but as we'll see in a minute, they can have a serious impact. For a lot of people, they don't intend to engage in incivility. As the economy, especially in 08, 09, 2010, was really in dire straits, organizations were letting people go, and so people were taking on the jobs of other people. Maybe they were doing 2 or 3 times the work they used to do. Stress goes up. And as we've seen over the last several years, so has incivility in workplaces. Okay? So people don't maybe intend to be uncivil. It's not necessarily strategic, not saying it can't be, because I've seen that as well. But a lot of times it is a stress response. Or they're just so focused on getting their job done. You know, you walk in to work and say, hey, so-and-so. So-and-so doesn't, say anything because they are so focused on getting that report out or making sure they get things done well or on time that they're just focused in and they're stressed out. Now, why should we care about incivility? One of the problems with incivility is it's pervasive. 96% of U.S. workers have experienced it and 99% have witnessed it. Huge numbers. What are some of the consequences? There are lots of them. For a lot of people, they decrease their work effort, their time. They decrease their work quality, especially like in manufacturing, which leads to all kinds of problems for the organization as well. They stress out over the incident. Even if it's just rudeness, it stays with you and it impacts your ability to focus. Try and avoid the offender, and they're less likely to want to stay with that organization. They want to escape. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't, depending on their mobility, job mobility. Here's a picture from the movie Office Space. Motivation. It's not that I'm lazy, it's that I just don't care. People who are the targets of incivility, and even sometimes not targets, just observers, have problems with motivation. If my coworkers treat me badly, well, why should I help them with their job? Why should I work harder if my organization doesn't protect me from these behaviors? So there are performance costs. With targets of incivility, decline in work, huge decline in helpfulness. Again, if my coworkers treat me badly, why should I help them out? But it affects even people who just observe it. Maybe they're not the target, but they see it happening to someone else. And for a lot of observers, they experience that incivility vicariously. So maybe I'm rude to my department chair, Jim, but our dean sees it. He may still feel an impact from that, okay? The observer may see the look on the person's face that says, oh, that really cut me to the core. That hurt my feelings. That was frustrating, whatever. So it impacts both targets and observers. Now, incivility targets are also less likely to want to learn new skills. Again, that whole motivation thing that's undermined. They're less energetic, partly because they're stressed out about what's going on. And they're a lot less satisfied with their jobs. Going to work is not a satisfying or fulfilling experience. They're also less likely to act in the company's best interests. They're not going to go above and beyond the call of duty. These behaviors also have HR costs. How many of you here are in HR? I'm sure you will, this will resonate with many of you. Managers and executives of Fortune 1000 companies several years ago said they spent about 13% of their work time, 7 full weeks a year, dealing with the fallout of incivility at work. Huge chunk of time that could be better spent selecting and recruiting the right people, crafting benefits and compensation plans that really motivate people and keep them there at the organization, finding out ways to promote creativity and problem solving, but instead they're spending a lot of time dealing with the fallout. In 2007, Cisco Systems said incivility cost them an estimated $8.3 million annually. Huge cost. One of my passions about studying toxic work environments is how those environments impact employees, and then how it impacts the employees and their family after they leave the workplace. So this is research that I had published a few years back in the Journal of Organizational Behavior. And I looked at about 200 employees who reported their experience of workplace incivility. And what I found was that incivility, remember, these are what we call low-level behaviors. It's rudeness. So it is stressful. And what we found is that that stress leads to an less functioning family. That stress leaves the incumbent's workplace, undermines the well-being of the family, and this is from the spouse's perspective. So an employee goes home, they're stressed, the spouse recognizes that, and that stress leads to marital dissatisfaction. So some people might say, well, who cares? We don't care if our employees have happy marriages. Doesn't affect my organization. But it does. Because marital discord and conflict leads to less productivity, lower performance at work. So it still goes back and affects the workplace. I would argue it's important for us to have strong families, so even this finding about marital dissatisfaction is really, really important. All right, this is also a picture from Office Space. Poor Milton. If you haven't seen Office Space, I highly recommend it, especially if you've ever worked in Cubicleville. Great movie. You will see a lot of things. You're like, oh, I remember that when I worked at such and such place. So he says he's been treated uncivilly, mostly by his boss, maybe kind of behind his back by his coworkers. They kind of make fun of him. They keep moving his desk around. At the end of the movie, his desk is like in the basement, and he decides he's going to burn this place down. So hopefully people don't resort to that, but people do seek revenge for incivility. Revenge is not so sweet. 94% of their targets get even with the offender, either by engaging in incivility themselves, right back at you, quid pro quo, or by reducing helpfulness, things like that. 88% of targets get even with their organization. Employees expect the organization to take steps to prevent these kind of behaviors and to send a signal that this type of behavior is not appropriate, not professional. So how do they do this? 75% of employees have stolen from their employer once. 37% have stolen twice. They find a way. Costs about $200 billion in employee theft in the US annually. Huge costs. What about turnover? Turnover's pricey. 25% of targets, and this is just of incivility, tend to leave. They get out of there when they can. But it has a similar effect on observers. So even if somebody hasn't been the target of incivility, they see it going on around them, it creates a culture and environment where they don't want to be anymore, and as soon as they can, they're like, bye-bye. This is expensive, right? Especially if you're in HR, you've hired people, you know how much it costs to recruit, to select, and train a new person. What's not to mention what happens while that position is open and unfulfilled, the cost to the organization. So, they may leave. So I'm interested in coworker incivility. Low-level rude behaviors, they create stress. But from those, we also can see an escalation or a spiral of bad behavior. Incivility tends to be unintentional. People don't really think about it. It's harmful. But what we find is having an abusive supervisor is even worse, or an abusive coworker. When we talk about abusive, with incivility, a lot of times it's unintentional. Abuse generally is seen as intentional, it's hostile, and some supervisors will use it strategically. I've talked to supervisors before who said, oh, well, I treat so-and-so that way, or I treat my employees this way because it makes them work harder. Hate to tell you, that's not what the research shows. Abusive supervision has all kinds of bad outcomes for those who are targeted. It also sets the tone for the organization, suggests this is how we treat each other, this is how the boss treats the subordinate. That has implications for those subordinates and for their subordinates, as we'll see in just a moment. So, Is your boss a slave driving psycho? Anybody ever had one of those? All right. Abusive supervisors. So maybe don't raise your hand, especially if you're sitting beside your supervisor, but think about that. Have you ever had a supervisor in your work career who you felt was abusive? They were hostile. Their behavior was intentional. Think about what kind of impact those behaviors and those interactions had on you and your life outside of work. Abusive supervisor tends to engage in a sustained display of hostile behaviors. So everybody has a really cruddy day every now and then, right? Maybe they fly off the handle, they're really stressed, maybe at something at work or something at home. But this tends to be something that's rather sustained. A lot of behaviors fall under this idea. So they may tell their subordinates their thoughts or feelings are stupid. The silent treatment can even be abusive, okay? If somebody's not talking to you, giving you the cold shoulder, shutting you out, that can be stressful. It makes you wonder, do they value you? All kinds of negative implications with that. They may put subordinates down in front of others, blame subordinates to save themselves the embarrassment. If they made a mistake, they may blame their subordinate, or they may take credit for a subordinate's efforts or work product. They break promises, they express anger at a subordinate, even if they're mad at somebody else. So kind of that kick the dog mentality. So this is a little picture from The Devil Wears Prada. How many of you have seen that movie? A few? So she says, by all means, this is a Miranda Priestley, abusive supervisor. By all means, move at a glacial pace. You know how that thrills me. Some of those comments like that where it's very sarcastic and demeaning and becomes a problem for subordinates. So again, a little self-assessment. When was the last time you said thank you at work or I'm sorry at work, especially to a subordinate? When was the last time a subordinate or coworker brought you bad news? One thing we find is that we move up the corporate ladder, people are less and less likely to bring us bad news, especially if they think we are going to lose it or fly off the handle because we're telling them something they don't want to hear. Or when was the last time a subordinate quit, or even worse, multiple subordinates in a very short period of time? People don't quit jobs. More often than not, they quit bosses. So who cares about abusive supervision? Well, fortunately, not as many people experience this as incivility, unless you're a nurse. And then you're much more likely to have experienced it. So, abusive supervision tends to cost the U.S. economy about $23.8 billion annually in absentee costs, lower workplace productivity, things like that. And those are just estimates. So, what are some consequences? Lots of consequences for abusive supervision, and they tend to be even more pervasive than incivility. One of the things that got me interested in some research I'm currently conducting that, like Dr. McClellan said, looks at actual health care outcomes and costs related to a friend of mine who worked for an abusive supervisor for a while. She said the guy would abuse some people in their group, not others. He seemed to use it strategically. But when she was about 6 or 7 months pregnant, she ended up in the hospital for a week because of the stress of dealing with this supervisor. Hugely problematic. So one of the things we find is that abuse supervision tends to trickle down at least 2 levels in an organization. So a boss is abusive to a subordinate, that subordinate is much more likely to be abusive to their subordinate, and so on. So it creates that culture. It does trickle down, as do the effects. Lowers subordinate creativity and self-esteem. We see huge effects on subordinate emotional exhaustion, trying to manage their emotions while being the target of abuse is problematic. Because most of us, if our supervisor's abusive to us, we may not say something back, especially if we want to keep our job, right? So we hold that in. We have to manage our emotions, which is very stressful. Depression's higher, insomnia is higher, and subordinates are much less likely to go above and beyond the call of duty. Now, like I said, one of my passions is looking at how these bad workplace behaviors affect the family. So a recent study I had looked at how being the target of an abusive supervisor leads to what we call work-family conflict. So when does my work interfere with my family? Either because I spend so much time at work that I don't have time for family, I'm so stressed by work that I can't properly engage with family, the behaviors that I engage in at work don't work at home. And that leads to relationship tension in the marriage and a decrease in family functioning. So again, we see problems with the marriage, which we know can translate back to problems at work. And family functioning relates to the whole family. So it may be the children too. How well does the family relate to one another, function as a group? So that's hugely problematic. This study was published of mine in the Journal of Personnel Psychology. Okay, is anybody depressed now? Oh, sorry. All right, here's the good stuff. An ounce of prevention. First, you've got to keep uncivil people or people who are more likely to act uncivilly out of your organization. Don't let them in the first place, because they are notoriously hard, and I think for a number of people, next to impossible to retrain. All right? Whether they're vendors, they're contractors, customers, employees, especially on the vendors and clients, customers, a lot of times organizations are more willing to put up with that type of behavior because they're like, oh, well, we need this contractor, we need this client. That contractor, that client is costing you more by keeping them on than that contract is worth, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So there are lots of tools that you can use for selecting people based on especially like personality traits that will help you keep uncivil people out of your organization. It's also important to teach civility through building competencies, especially those uncivil people that talk over people in meetings, training them to be a better listener and wait their turn. Conflict resolution. I also teach the negotiation class at Utah State. Honestly, I think it's a class every single undergraduate should have, whether you're in the business school or not. It helps people not only negotiate for a job, salaries, things like that, houses, cars, what here would be snowmobiles, things like that. But it helps them solve conflict productively without burning bridges, without damaging the relationship with people further. So, teaching them conflict resolution and negotiation skills, how to deal with difficult people, because we all have them, and also how to manage stress, because jobs are stressful. We can't completely prevent that. So how can we train people and educate people to manage their stress at work so they don't take it out on their coworkers, or so they don't go home and take it out on their families? What else can an organization do? Set zero tolerance expectations. I would say you really need to start with your mission and your value statement. It should be in there. That sends a powerful message. Should shape the behavior, and it sets a norm kind of for how we treat each other. Next, you want to have managers in particular look in the mirror. They need to live by the norms that are set. If your values and mission statement is just a statement and doesn't carry any weight, isn't meaningful, that can be even more harmful than if there wasn't anything in there as to how you treat each other. One way to do this is also through upward evaluations or anonymously collected 360-degree feedback. So finding out from supervisors, from employees, maybe vendors, coworkers, how does this person treat people around them? If you're hearing bad things from a lot of different areas, that is a huge red flag that needs to be addressed immediately. Don't ignore it. Which brings me to my next point. Take complaints seriously. Too often we say, oh, well, so-and-so was just having a bad day. If you as a manager or someone in human resources is hearing on a regular basis about bad behavior from someone in your organization, you have to take that seriously. One of the ways to do this is with an open door policy. Again, this has to be a real open door policy. If you have an open door policy, but then every time someone comes in to share a complaint with you about what somebody did at work, and you're like, hi, Bob, come in, have a seat. Yeah, that open door policy is going to be meaningless. So it has to be a real open door policy. Gather the data and act quickly. Anecdotally, I know too many people who have gone to HR or gone to their manager and said, this person's behavior is a problem. They say, oh, okay, yeah, we'll investigate. They may never hear anything. That tends to further victimize the target, and it tends to embolden the abuser. Not good. What else? Don't make excuses for powerful instigators or high performers. We saw this with the Catholic Church and issues they had moving abusive priests around. They think, oh, this will solve the problem. We'll just put them in a different situation, it'll be okay. If somebody is abusive in one situation, they're likely to be abusive in another situation. Don't move them around. It's really tempting to do because then you're like, oh, quick fix, yay. Abusive supervisors rarely have a quick fix. And also, remember that incivility is like a virus. I have research in the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology where I looked at, does incivility spread, and if so, how? And it does. It's contagious. When people especially hear about it from someone else, when it becomes gossipy, ooh, did you hear what so-and-so, what Bob said to Sam? Oh, no, tell me what happened. That tends to spread it even faster. So I highly recommend this book. A rather indelicate title, and from what I have read, Dr. Sutton, who is a longtime professor at Stanford, searched around trying to find a better term, but he was like, this is the only one that really fits. And his research indicates, was what I was talking about earlier, when I said that it's costing your organization more when you keep these people on board. When you say, oh, but they brought in this $5 million contract. We can't get rid of Joe. Yeah, you can, and yeah, you should. Because it's costing your organization more even than that $5 million contract. If you have somebody at your workplace or who is uncivil, and especially if they rise to the level of abusive, you can always go get this book. It's pretty cheap on Amazon. Slide it under their door. I don't know. Just a suggestion. Not really. That wouldn't promote civility. But he does have some good, lots of good research. So if you're someone who's like, this is a problem in my organization and higher-ups aren't taking it seriously, this is a great book to go to say, look, here's what some specific research says. And it's an easy read. All right, a couple of unique approaches. So what can we do? What can each of us do to promote a more civil environment? Okay, I promise my students, especially for the negotiation class, the first day, my goal is for you to leave every single day from class with something you can use immediately. For accounting, they may use it after they graduate. Finance, maybe marketing too, it's later on. With negotiation, say if you're not practicing every day that you leave class, you're not building your negotiation skills. And so this is my goal for you today, to also leave with something you can use right away. So I love this healthcare system in Louisiana. They have what they call the 10-5 rule. The 10 refers to making eye contact with anyone within 10 feet. I've started practicing this, especially at Utah State. I've got about a 10-minute walk from my office to my car. And in Texas, it's a thing. Like if you walk beside somebody, and I grew up in Texas, you say hi or you say hey or something like that. Not a ton, but just recognize the other person. In the West, I don't think that's as much of a thing, but I'm on a mission. And so trying to make contact with people I pass between my office and my car. It is not an easy thing to do, especially if it's not the culture. But Ochsner healthcare system has this rule. They're also supposed to greet anyone within 5 feet. So what does this do? It enforces or reinforces the idea that every person has value. That just because you're the CEO and you're walking beside one of the interns doesn't mean you can just walk past them and ignore them. That everybody has value and that you're recognizing them for their value, their humanity, them as an individual person. This healthcare system also has what they call the no venting rule. So they create a, quote, safe place where nurses or other professionals can go and say, this is an issue, this is driving me crazy, whatever the problem is. It can be a problem when people vent out to everyone, kind of like that gossiping about incivility. You vent to other coworkers, it spreads. So they want to contain some of that. And then they follow it up with including these as measures in performance evaluations. A good way to provide a carrot and a stick for getting the behavior that they want. easy things for us to do. Actually, I wouldn't say easy, because I'll be honest. When I walk by and I try and say hi or look somebody in and they just keep walking, and especially if they're not on their phone, because a lot of times they're on their phone and okay, whatever. It is. It can be tiring, but I think it's well worthwhile, especially within our organizations. And then lastly, Southwest Airlines, they have a whole department devoted to sending out cards and things like that when somebody has a sick relative, has a baby. And to give you an example of the culture that Southwest has created, back in 2004, I was flying back and forth between Austin and Nashville, and sitting on the aisle of the plane, we were in the air, and I was reading or working on something, and was kind of sitting there doing this or something, and a flight attendant walked by, and then she backtracked. And she said, "Ma'am, are you cold?" And honestly, I hadn't even noticed. And I was like, "Oh, yeah, kind of." And she was like, "Do you want a blanket?" "Oh, sure, that'd be great, thanks." Well, she didn't come back, she didn't come back, and she didn't come back. So about, I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 minutes later, she finally came back and she was like, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, we're all out of blankets. But here, take my sweater." Whew. Made an impact. And it suggested that Southwest doesn't just see their flyers as customers or dollar signs, but as people who have needs. And so she was trying to fill those needs. Left a huge impact. What questions do you have? Yes, ma'am.
Mind one moment and the next moment, great in evaluations, but then downplays your work in the next day.
So their behavior is a little unpredictable? Yeah, I would say that those types of situations are good for some of the maybe in-house or maybe out-of-house training where people learn stress management, because sometimes that's what we'll see. When the behavior is unpredictable, it stems from a stress reaction, kind of that fight or flight. And maybe, the fight is lashing out at someone. The flight may be becoming withdrawn, which some people may think as rude if they walk by and say, "Hi, Mary," and Mary doesn't say anything. So I would say training, and I think that's where it becomes really important for supervisors to have some sort of relationship with their subordinates, because very often we have a situation where it's something outside of work that's driving behavior at work. A colleague at another university went up for tenure and did not get tenure, which is a pretty big deal. It means you have to go on the market, go to a different school. And apparently in the meeting that he had with his department right before he went up was very contentious. And he was flipping through pages and mad and just, really behaved badly. And they were like, "Well, we don't want this guy." And he'd seemed kind of off, but nobody had really talked to him about it. And then we found out like a month after the tenure decision that, I don't know, like 3 or 4 days before, he found out his wife was having an affair. So a lot of times these stress outside of work spills over to work, just like work stress spills over to the family. So knowing kind of what's going on in your subordinates' lives, not prying a ton, but if you have a good relationship, you also need to, that puts you in a situation to know what's going on that might be driving that behavior and be able to help. What if you are the subordinate and the supervisor behaves badly? The first thing I would suggest is if it's really egregious, start documenting, because you may eventually decide you need to go talk to HR. And there are some people that are in a situation where they are ready and feel the need to do that sooner and others later. But if you get to that point, you need to document the dates, times, all those things. Some subordinates, and it depends a lot on the supervisor, can go talk to their supervisor and say, "Hey, I feel like your response to my question it kind of surprised me." You have to choose your words really carefully so it doesn't come across, I think, judgmentally or accusingly. But again, that's where the conflict resolution skills become really important, because then it allows you to approach someone who you are having a conflict with, and sometimes that's where some of these behaviors stem from, is that conflict, and know how to do it in a positive way. If it gets better, great. But for a lot of people, if it doesn't get better, the situation, they leave. Good question. Jeff?
Thank you for that very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Touched on the consequences of incivility and abuse on teamwork and productivity within the context of the work environments that we're all, whatever our experience has been. And I'm wondering if you or others have actually extended this to look at government.
Oh, government specifically?
With the climate that we have in
Yes.
the states, etc.
Yes. Actually, there have been a few articles I've read through with, kind of analyzing some of the interactions, especially in national politics between Democrats and Republicans, and they need training and conflict resolution like nobody's business. They're terrible. Yes. Well, and for a lot of them, I've had a few students who have worked in DC as interns, and the culture there is really, really terrible. That is going to take a really, really long time to change. And a lot of it does stem from ego. And I think a lot of these, what we see is that ego, especially for abusive supervision, plays a role. People think, oh, well, this isn't that big of a deal. I can treat my people this way. I'm fabulous, whatever. Nurses have said that's kind of what they perceive is going on and why they experience so much more abusive supervision than other sectors. Ego's tricky, yeah, because you need ego to be able to operate on somebody and cut somebody open, right? But you have to manage that as well. Yes, sir?
So it sounds like probably the best way to avoid these really awful situations is to not get into them in the first place. What strategies do you have?
Sure.
If you're looking at going to work somewhere, to kind of pick it up on that stuff, because with a short visit you may not necessarily.
Absolutely. That's a great question. And one of the things I tell my students is, one, pay attention to how organizations treat you during the recruitment process. Pay attention to how organizations treat you in the recruitment process. If they treat you badly on the front end, how much worse, when they're supposed to be putting their best foot forward, are they going to treat you after you are on board? And I have a personal example from that. Several years ago, I went on the job market and had an offer from a university. And generally, and I think this goes for everybody, but especially in academia, we tend to have time to make our decisions. These are big decisions, moving cross country, uprooting your family. I got a call at like 5 p.m., I don't know, like on a Monday or Tuesday with the offer, and they said, we need to know by 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. I don't think so. That was a huge red flag for me. If you're going to not give me time to make the right decision for my family, whoo, big red flag. No. And then the other flip side of that is if talk to, not only look at your experiences of recruitment, but talk to people in the industry. Try and get kind of that inside scoop. Find out what the culture is at the organization. I suggest my students go to the USU alumni directory and try and find out USU alumni who work for an organization they're interviewing with and say, hey, can I talk to you? Find out what it's really like to work there. That inside scoop is huge because it can help you avoid some of that. Yes, sir?
Is personality testing commonly used, and is it effective?
It can be effective. I would not say it's 100% effective. There are some tests, like integrity testing that organizations will use and some personality testing. One thing that we see is people who are more conscientious, which is what we call one of the big 5 personality traits, more conscientious, less likely to engage in some of these behaviors. So personality testing can be one good way of kind of weeding out those who are going to behave badly. I would also recommend, similarly, if you're looking to hire somebody, work that informal network. Find out why did they leave their last organization, like really leave. What do people think about working with them? Things like that. Again, trying to get the inside scoop. Yeah, great question. What else?
Kind of going along those lines, everybody was hired, will interview people, and most people can't hold their breath during an interview. And, sometimes you see that if you want to get rid of somebody and they're calling you for a reference and it's instability, you're going, oh, no, they're an evil person.
They are fabulous. Yes. Yes.
I'm always convinced that, calling you for this kind of sort of feedback always works, but, it's suggest a good way of, while you're interviewing.
Sure.
Because I don't think those negative character traits that you present yourself at most interviews.
No, not in the interviews, and I would say especially not from the references that they put down. Yeah, and so many organizations now, if you call them for a formal reference, they are going to tell you the person's hire date, their separation date, maybe their title, and that's about it for legal reasons. So that's why I think that informal network is so key. Somebody who you really hopefully trust, which is why it pays to go to the conferences and network with people in your industry so that you can call up somebody and say, hey, we're looking at so-and-so, and I noticed that she worked for you 4 years ago, and what do you think? Pays to invest your time that way, absolutely. Yes, sir.
In an abusive workplace, I work with nurses every day. There's been testimony given on the Hill, abusive, including from one nurse and one by a government employee, that says the abusive environment was so bad it affected their health, disrupted to their family, and they want a law that says this is it's more than sexual harassment. It's abusive environment. They want a law that will not define abuse, but also make a means by which there can be redress in action. What do you think about legislation for this situation?
Yes. We do have, I'm aware of several states in the U.S. that are pursuing some of this, and there are some nonprofit think tanks that are actively helping those states look at kind of how to do that. I will first say I am not an attorney. I saw my husband go through law school, and especially the first year of law school, and I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. I think it's tricky. I think we need more than what we have because the current laws like about discrimination and things like that don't cover some of these really egregious behaviors. I think crafting the laws is really tricky. I think it's probably more helpful to have organizations that kind of already do it on their own, but too often that's not how it works, and especially in some industries. So if there are legal consequences, punitive damages, but right now there isn't any recourse really for abused employees. Yes?
From your research, the role of factors as it pertains to ethnicity and gender and environmental instability. What roles and how large a roles do they play?
You know, I'm not aware of any research that has looked yet specifically at demography except for gender. And generally, at least with like abusive supervision, we tend to see male supervisors are more likely to engage in that. And the research on incivility and gender is really, really mixed. So I think a lot of that is probably driven by something else that's, you know, within that organization, the culture of the organization, things like that, because there's some research that says women are more likely to engage in incivility, and there's others that say men are more likely to. So I think we're still kind of teasing apart kind of what's going on there. But as far as the abusive supervision, yeah, the male gender more likely to engage in those behaviors. Yeah, good question. Yes, ma'am.
Tends to be less dramatic than abuse, or less definable sometimes than abuse.
Sure.
And can also be unintentional. Where does the line come in terms of reporting, documentation, intervention? Can you talk about that?
I can a little bit, and it is. It's like you said, it can be ambiguous, and a lot of times people don't intend it or even recognize it. They may have to stay. If somebody says, "Hey, you know, that was really rude," or you know, you have this pattern of being uncivil at work, and they're like, "No, I'm not. I have no clue." And sometimes they don't. And we tend to also see these behaviors in people who are less self-aware. I think it's easier to document and make a case for the more egregious behaviors, and a lot of times that the training and the going to a coworker one-on-one and saying, using those conflict resolution behaviors and skills and knowledge to say, hey, I really enjoy working with you, but you know, in the morning, maybe they're a grumpy person in the morning and short with everybody or ignore everybody, but say, write down a couple of specific things. You don't want to bombard them with a whole sheet of paper, though. You have to be strategic. But I think, yeah, a lot of it goes back to training and having a good relationship with your coworkers. And if you don't, getting help and skills and advice, mentoring for some of that. Good question. Yes, sir. Hi.
Great presentation. I don't wish I could have had this presentation earlier in my career.
Sure.
My question goes back to an earlier slide that we had. I think it was the slide that pertained to people don't quit their jobs as their bosses.
Yes.
And you gave a pie chart about, I think it was about 25% of employees quit. And so I was wondering if there's any metrics or anything that you have or know about those 25%. About how long were they at their job before they reached their saturation and quit and left?
No, I don't know of any research yet that's really looked at that time frame. One phenomenon that we do see is a lot of times, especially people are more likely to leave an abusive supervisor situation than they are like an incivility situation. Incivility, if you're a target, 20% of them are likely to leave. And so people are more likely to maybe put up with that. It's not quite as harmful. But with abusive supervisors, what we tend to see is a ratcheting up of the behavior. It starts out, maybe one day something happened, and then, it's not again for a week. And then as the behavior goes on, it escalates in both severity and frequency. And so, I don't know, that's something I think really important to look at as far as time frame. My guess is it's going to depend a lot on the situation and on the person, and whether they're using it strategically or not. I mean, if an abusive supervisor says, I do this to get higher performance out of my people, you're probably going to see it a lot more regularly. Yeah. That's right. Thank you for that question. Any others? Yes, sir.
I thought I heard you say is abusers normally don't recover. What happens to these talented people? Or what can you do with them?
Yeah. That's a really great and really, really hard question. It's not something we've studied systematically yet. Anecdotally, I've seen evidence that, especially if the abuser is engaging the behavior because of some temporary stressor, maybe a merger and acquisition at work, or a threat that they're going to lose their job, or maybe something going on at home or outside of work. If it's a temporary stressor that's kind of driving the behavior, helping them manage that stress and then not take it out on employees tends to be helpful. If it's somebody who you can look back 10 years, I would say even 5 years in their work experience, and they were doing engaging in these behaviors 5 years ago, retraining them tends to not be that effective. And so they do tend to hop around a lot more or get high enough up in organizations that people are less likely to say, hey, this behavior is going to stop, unless it's, the highest echelons and gets rid of a VP or someone like that that's engaging in really bad behavior. The prognosis, unfortunately, is not great. They all still have value. So, I guess one option is to put them in a situation or structure their work so that they interact with people less. I would also say it's important to put those expectations as part of their job description and part of the performance evaluation process. Tie it to bonuses. You have to be careful with that then, because you don't want to incent subordinates to lie to protect their supervisor, because it's tricky. Yeah, good question. Really hard question. Yes, sir.
Done about leadership, the role of leadership.
A lot of that goes back to, I think, the cultural norms set by the organization, and again, that the top leadership sets the norm and how that can also have, we talked about how abusive supervision can trickle down, and that's a bad thing. That positive leadership, transformational leadership, things like that can also trickle down as well. So one thing that we see sometimes is that someone can have a really great relationship with their supervisor's supportive, and it's kind of a Jekyll and Hyde thing. So Monday, really, really supportive. Wednesday, they're having a bad day, they're stressed, they take that on their supervisor. So it's not It's not that people who engage in abusive supervision are all bad. Again, some of them are very talented. And some of them can be great supervisors. I would say when you do kind of have those Jekyll and Hyde situations, again, it goes back to training and maybe also a mentor. Somebody who, I tell my students, even still now when I'm making a decision about how to go forward in something at work, we used to see them a lot. What would Jesus do bracelets? I would ask myself, what would Jeff do? Jeff was one of my first supervisor, manager when I was at Deloitte & Touche, and he was phenomenal. And so even though I haven't interacted with him on a daily basis, gosh, like 10 years, he still has an impact. And the way he worked with people and the way he treated people. And so I think about things like that. What would Jeff do? And those mentors, I think, are huge. Because some people are just clueless. They don't know. And they think they're engaging in a behavior that's going to be helpful. They don't realize the harm that it's bringing. Great question.
So this morning's Chronicle of Higher Education, there's a story about the president of Butler University who was employing 360 degree feedback and coaching from a company called Flash with his provost and top senior administrators of the university.
Okay, interesting.
What do you think about that?
I think the devil is in the details and how they carry that out. I think when I was at Deloitte, we used 360 degree feedback, and I think it can be really helpful. It helps highlight what people's strengths are, that they continue to keep doing those things, and it can highlight when there is considerable agreement where people's weaknesses are. And then, you have to have those, what I call difficult conversations about, okay, these are clearly your weaknesses, and, 3 out of 4 people said this is a problem. How are you going to deal with that? And that takes a lot of guts on everyone's part, to be honest and to be willing to take that feedback and go, oh, man, I didn't realize I was so bad in this area. What can I do to get better? And then, again, tying it to rewards, I think, is really important, so that you underline what's important, what's valuable. Because too often it's just the bottom line that's valuable, and people get passed over. Yeah, great. I'll have to go look at that. I was up too early to look at that this morning, looking at presentation stuff. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
As a parent of 3 nurses, believe me, this rang true, and something you really want to think about. The other thing I was scratching my head about was really Congress and egos. Makes sense. Meredith, great presentation, and what a showcase for your program, Jim for the department, and Doug for the college, and of course for the university. Welcome to Sunrise. We hope we'll see you next October, or this coming October, for our next presentation with Victor Lee. See you then.